We're here
Hi.
recording. Look at us.
Hello.
It's been a wild
Hello.
month.
It has been a wild month.
It has been, and it's still a wild month. I mean, we're not done with it yet.
Books and lizards and just all
Tonsillectomies and
tonsils and
New
all
York
kinds of
trips,
jazz.
and
Yeah.
it's yeah.
And we're
Um,
still here.
we're still here, you guys. We're still here. We owe you some new episodes. They're coming. We've got a lot of
Mm.
interviews kind of lined up. We're doing some coaching sessions soon. Um, we've had to do a couple throwback episodes because it has been a month. That's all we're
Yeah.
going to say. Maybe we can do an episode just on the month of April and May.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to answer a question. And we
Okay.
feel like we get some variation of this question a lot. And I know
Mm.
that we definitely talk about this in my codependency group regularly too. Like, um, kind of this idea of finding the middle ground. So I'll read the question. Well, I'll try. It's a little bit all over, but this idea of like, as I'm starting to do my recovery around codependency,
Mm.
and I find that I sometimes swing into hyper independence, right? How
Mhm.
do I kind of find that middle ground? So the question is specifically around this idea of like, and I'll do a couple air quotes here for people who can see me on YouTube but can't. I'm doing air quotes. All of these like these sayings that we hear: choose you,
Mm.
do you, put yourself first. Basically, what this person is asking is, how do we still do all these things, like choose you, do you, put yourself first, without swinging into hyper independence? Like, what's the kind of middle ground between codependency and hyper independence? Which obviously you and I would say is interdependence. And we haven't done, I guess, an episode on that in a long time. But this person is just confused. Like they say, what is middle ground?
Mm. Well, to me, I think there's a way that these like do you put yourself first, all of those things that this person is describing as sort of adages that you hear in the cultural
Mm,
vernacular have sort of, to me, missed the larger point of, I think, what we may be speaking to when we talk about like reframing these codependent paradigms and ways of relating to one another. And to me, the thing of do you is really have a sense of self. I
mm,
think something that comes up a lot, and you certainly speak to, is that like codependency work is identity work. And so often when we are in a space of really being enmeshed with another person, it's because we don't have a sense of self that is differentiated enough from that person that we feel safe
mm,
expressing ourselves, insisting upon what feels true for me, feeling like if there is enough distance between us to sort of keep those fires burning that we need to have a sense of aliveness in relationship, that I won't be abandoned or that this
mm.
person won't in whatever way. I don't know what the stories we tell ourselves are, but I mean, in saying that, there's a plethora of stories that we tell ourselves, but that this person will be upset with me, will leave
Mm,
me, will make me feel some way that I felt in the past that I'm sort of defending against. But the sense of self is the inner reminder that I will be a self regardless of if this person is in my life. I was a self before they came, I'll be a self after. God forbid if that's not something I want, they are here. But that it's really like I am in this sense of like fundamentally, I know I am here. You know what I mean?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like as somebody who has been on this journey, right, since I was 25, this kind of specifically codependency recovery journey, and now doing this work day by day, minute by minute while in a partnership, I
Mhm.
feel like even I sometimes struggle with finding this middle ground, right?
Mm.
And I was also thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking, I also struggle with it even in like my relationship with my kid.
Mm.
It's like
Mhm.
how to not like air quote lose yourself. My little one, obviously, she got her tonsils out like 10 days ago, and it's just been 10 days of hell. And I was telling you, I felt like I was in the newborn phase again. And it was mostly because I felt like I was like, what day is it? What time is it? Like, I haven't worked out. I'm not eating. And I was like, "Oh, there we are again." We've like lost ourselves in the survival of what felt like the newborn stage of a baby. And I only bring that up to say I see people lose themselves to that level or that extreme when they're in relationship. And to your point, having a sense of self means I can care for myself and care for you in this partnership, and
Mm,
one doesn't have to diminish the other. And I feel like that to me, when I'm talking to clients, is a pretty big indicator of swinging into that more codependency side of the spectrum that this person's talking about is, are you
mm.
both able to care for yourselves and care for the relationship as its own entity or the other person, right? Without it diminishing the care for self. And to me, that's kind of what I go through in my head when I feel like I'm slipping or when I feel like I'm kind of getting into my old habits. Um, I realize I'm losing that ability to care for myself.
Yeah. I think it's important to name this as another one of those places that isn't like a point of arrival or a fixed
Yes. Ooh,
state, and that
yes.
it's like a practice that we have to
Hmm.
continuously come back to. And I think, what you were just saying brought up for me. I think in relationship, it is harder, to be
Hmm.
honest, because I struggled a lot more with the things you're describing before my marriage ended. And when I have more time by myself, as you do when you're co-parenting with another person, it's very easy to not lose myself and my child because I am like reminded that I am a self. And I've talked about this, like when you're away from Logan for like a couple days, it's like, oof, there I am again.
There I
Like
am.
forgot me for a minute. And that's something that I talk to moms a lot about. And some of this is like, I don't think it's the exact same conversation in terms of the way we're socialized as women and the way we're socialized as
Hmm.
men. I think men struggle because of the way they're socialized a lot of times a lot less with this.
Mm.
Just in terms of like, I think society gives men a lot more like permission to like continue to do things that remind them that they are a self, like go to the
Yes.
gym, go play golf, all these things that are like me time unapologetically. Whereas we as women, one, because a lot of times like we are that primary figure in a
Hmm.
child's life initially, but there's just like a lot more guilt that we feel a lot of times
Yes.
when we're in that environment. Whereas when we're like removed from it, it's like, oh, like I remember the first time we talk about this when I was away from my child at grad school for like a night. I resisted it so much. And then once I was there, I was like, oh my God, there I am again. This feels amazing. Right. Um, and so I'm saying all of that to say, I think it's really important to not shame ourselves
Hmm.
when we find like, oh, I've lost myself in this role of,
Hmm.
mother, partner, whatever. I feel really enmeshed in this. It's like, oh, yep, that's a really natural thing that happens. So let me remind myself, let me
Yep.
take some space to like pull
Course
back and
correct.
be a me. And we are all going to do that in different relationships in our lives. I think it's just really normal, but it's like a practice to bring ourselves back.
This last Saturday, I went to an all day music festival and
Mm.
it had been on my calendar for a while. And I knew that her surgery was, the week prior to that. And when I decided to go to this festival, I was like, oh, she'll be fine by then. That'll be like, 7 or 8 whole days later. Well, turns out she wasn't fine. She was
Mm.
still in the thick of it. But I went anyway. And I was with a couple people, but I was with a guy friend and a girlfriend. And the guy friend of mine said, oh, so John's like, he's really on dad duty today. And I thought, no one ever says
Mm.
mom duty.
That's right.
They don't say that shit, right? And I mean, obviously he said it innocently enough, he doesn't have kids himself. And I said, yeah, he is. I said, and you know who doesn't feel guilty about it? Me. Because and it's not John wasn't, he's been trying. She just only wants me when she's sick. But I
Mhm,
was like, listen, I'm the one that's always on duty, always
mhm,
24 fucking 7. So, of course, there was a little bit of guilt when I first left, of course. And then when I got there and I was like, oh my God, my soul needed this so much. And like you said, like remembering who you are,
mhm,
I felt the feelings. I acknowledged the guilt. I reminded myself that she would be fine.
mm,
And I leaned in to having a really good fucking time. And it was like exactly what I needed. Um, so yeah, I mean, I feel like parenting and partnership actually in a lot of ways, this idea of choosing yourself or finding yourself or whatever language you want to use, it can be a similar practice. It's like I love what you said. It's like you have a moment where you're like, oh, okay, there it is. Like I've done that thing, I've lost myself, I've overextended myself, I'm not paying attention, I'm not taking care of me. And then you get to, like you always say, you get to do a U-turn. You get to
mm,
say, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to make a plan to go wherever by myself. I'm going to go to this music festival, or I'm going to go out with my friends. And you make it happen.
yeah. Yeah, I think I was just thinking about the way that this person was asking the question, and I ran a singlehood group, which now saying it like unpartnered, right? Like versus
Mhm.
like I'm single because
Single.
I'm not single, I'm not incomplete. And I think that there's a consistent theme that came up so often in that group was like people that had just come out of a
Mm.
partnership or were like negotiating like, what it is to be single in this world. And the common thing was always like I lost myself in a while. Like I
Mhm.
didn't even recognize myself as I came out of this relationship. And one of the things that it really solidified for me is there's something that's just so culturally normalized
Mm.
in the level of enmeshment that we cultivate so often in relationships. It's like, I heard someone saying that their husband will be out and be like, "Where's your wife?" Like, or like
Mhm.
if one person goes home early or one person's out by themselves, like we make those things mean something. You and I talk
Mhm.
a ton about like this thing of like you were just like out with a friend who's a guy, and we talk about like, the way that we sort of like have these narratives around having friends of opposite gender and what that means. And I think it's just really important for us to define the parameters of our relationships for ourselves so that we don't
Mhm.
sort of participate unwittingly in this cultural paradigm of once you are a unit that is like
That's it.
separate from the rest of the
Mhm.
world and you lose yourself because first of all, I think it is really easy to feel like I'm not a self in this anymore. I
Mm.
don't know where I end and you begin and vice versa. But also, I just think that it leads to a lot of lack of fulfillment in our
Mhm.
relationships when we do
Mhm.
that because if you and me are like one person, there's no draw to you, there's no life force in that, there's no eros, and inevitably we will start to feel a deadening over time, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking that, and I'm sure a little bit of it is age for those listening. I just turned 40 last week. Uh, but I actually feel like this partnership, and I've had a few long-term partnerships in my life. And I feel like I'm actually more myself
Mhm,
in this relationship than any other time prior.
mhm,
And I also think that's a big indicator of the work that you're doing around sense of self, around finding that balance between, that balance of interdependence. Is, have you lost yourself? Like you were saying, we hear so many people say, do you recognize yourself? What happened to you before they came into the
mhm,
picture? Or do you feel like you are the most yourself? Because I would argue that a partnership is something that actually helps you be more yourself, actually props you up to be the most yourself.
mhm,
And if that's not happening, then I think that there's things to look at in the relationship. And listen, I think almost all of us, when you get into something in the beginning, especially, and like all the chemicals, and you're obsessed with this person, and you're like,
mhm,
that's normal. It happens, right? But we're talking like you blink your eyes and you're in something for a year and you're like, oh my God, we literally never leave each other's side. Or like you
mhm,
said, people are asking, oh, where's this other person when you leave? Or, oh, I'm not allowed to have friends of the opposite, gender. That's when you start to go, is this actually helping me foster the best version of me? Like who, I don't know. There's something about that. There's something about a partnership, and not just a partnership, a friendship too, right? Like I would say this is any chosen relationship. Does this chosen relationship help me be the most me? You
mhm.
know?
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking about that as a statement, right? Like, I think that that's beautiful. And I think yeah, it's so relational. It's so alive. It's like, is there safety here? Do
Mm,
we like reflect back the aspects of one another that are like sometimes, like, I think the hard conversations, like, those are also aspects of what makes me be the quote best version of myself that we
mm,
don't talk about, like a lot of times like people think of that as like control, but a lot of times it's not. Like that's not how we like mold someone into the best version of themselves. It's really like, I was talking about well, I guess I was talking about with our friend this weekend, but it's like this thing of like the people that you like tell the hard things, that you say the thing even when it's hard, and there's safety in doing that. And that's something that you and I have certainly practiced in a way that's like been a growing edge for me in our relationship, right? Like the spaces where we challenge one another to stay in the hard conversations and that there's enough safety to do that. I think that's so much information about like we lose ourselves and self-abandon when it's like I do whatever I need to do to maintain this attachment, and a lot of times that means keeping the peace at all costs, you know?
Yeah. And that's the misconception, right? Is like I do what I have to do to maintain this attachment, i.e., keeping the peace. But what's really happening when we're doing that is we're losing ourselves. That's the disconnection to self, and
Mm.
ultimately the disconnection to the other person,
Yes.
right? And we think that because this person's body is still here, that somehow I'm keeping this attachment here, but
Mm.
it's not true, right? I mean, I think anybody listening can attest to the fact that when you're in that kind of don't rock the boat, keep the peace at all costs, you do have a moment of realization where you are suddenly, I don't know, let's say 6 months or a year down the road, and you have all these resentments. You don't really like that person that much anymore, let alone yourself, right?
Mm.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's something I've really had to pay attention to in my life is how often am I attempting to keep a body here,
Mm.
but I'm actually sacrificing the relationship itself for the sake of having that body here. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's something that you say often is like, these things that we do as humans are bad, but we're not bad.
Yeah.
And that to me is such a like quantifiable way of what it means to have a sense of self, that
Mm,
I'm going to feel worthy of loving myself, staying with myself, that I'm like still a decent person, even when I fall short, even when I'm not the most thoughtful and I
mhm,
let people down and disappoint them. Those things are human, but I can talk about it with them
mhm,
and I don't have to defend against hearing what they're saying because I know
mhm,
ultimately I can do things where I fall short and that doesn't mean I'm a bad person, but that's what it is to have a sense of self. And I think that is more in alignment with what I think of when I think of all those
mm,
things that person was naming at the beginning, like, you know, do you take care? It's like, no, just like believe that you are worthy, even as you fall short, even as you're like
yes,
stumbling through this life as we all are. That doesn't make you any less worthy of love, period.
period. Yeah, and I think, when you listen to this, you'll notice obviously there's no like here's the right answer. Here's like this
Mm,
hard line of like right, wrong, yes, no. It's not like that. It's a process. It's life,
mm,
and I think that for some of us, I know for me this used to be helpful when I was kind of earlier on in my process around discovering and really like getting in there with the codependency stuff is I would
mm.
actually schedule myself, and therapy might be this for some people or coaching, but I would schedule, or like maybe our groups, I would schedule regular check-ins with myself.
Mm.
Cause I think we all know life gets, excuse me, life gets really busy and hectic and chaotic. And I think that those of you watching are seeing Danae sneeze right now.
I was trying to mute, but I couldn't find it, sorry.
You're such a quiet sneezer though. You can't
Oh
even
my
hear
god.
it. um, do a regular check-in and like hold yourself. There it is.
There it is, sorry.
Do a regular check-in. Ask yourself the hard questions. Are you everything we've talked about in this episode? Like really think about it, and be honest with yourself and do some journaling and do some reflecting. And um, I think that is helpful for me. It's like holding myself accountable, basically. Because I think if we get too lost in life, we can again blink our eyes and then it's 6 months down the road and we're like, oh my God, I haven't done anything for myself in 6 months. Or
Mm,
oh my God, I don't recognize myself, right? But if you're making it a regular practice to check in with yourself, you won't get so far down the path that you have to like overcompensate to get back to self.
yeah, that's I mean, I love that, and I think I'm, like, thinking, "That's hard to do,"
It
right? Like,
is
it's
hard to
hard
do.
to, like, be honest with ourselves, but I think what can be an indicator is, like you always say, like, the resentment, the,
Hmm.
like, "Am I feeling irritated with everyone around me?" That's just, like, such a great indicator that I'm not taking enough time for myself, right? That I need some space, because we can just sort of, like, muscle
Muscle
through and
through.
keep going through life, and it's like, but if I feel like everybody's a problem and they're irritating the hell out of me, like, I might need some time for me, you know?
Yeah. I might need some time for me, and I might need to really like question some of my habits and my
Mm.
behaviors and my
Mhm.
relationships, including my relationships with my friends, with my kids, with my family, not just a partner.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
again, I mean, listen, we're both moms. We know momhood is, poof, it's a lot sometimes, and
Mm,
my kid got her tonsils out. There was nothing I could do. I had to be there. Like I said, I was back in that newborn phase. And a week went by and I was like, oh shit, right? I had that moment. And so I did the thing. I course
mm,
corrected. I took that day for myself and I needed it. And it allowed me to come back into the situation that's still a little bit of a shit show, right? But like a little bit more filled up. Entirely filled up? No, of course not. But
mm.
like a little bit more filled up. My reserves are a little bit back.
Yeah.
It's never going to be black and white. So ask yourself the hard questions, y'all. Check in regularly.
Mm,
Are you losing yourself? Are you able to care for this other person while simultaneously caring for yourself? Or do you have to choose? Like, are you only able to care for one or the other? That's
mm.
that's a pretty big indicator.